My name's Rebecca. I have Lynch syndrome, which is not an X-linked disease, but it does have some of the same reproductive issues that carriers of X-linked diseases have. Lynch syndrome can cause a variety of different cancers, including endometrial and ovarian cancer. And I myself did have endometrial cancer at a young age and elected to have my uterus and ovaries removed at that time. Well, I knew as early as grade school that cancer ran in my family, but it wasn't for a few more decades until they discovered the gene that caused the syndrome. I did get genetic testing when I was in my early 20s. And that did confirm that I had Lynch syndrome. So Lynch syndrome affects both males and females. It causes a variety of cancers. The most common one is colon cancer, but it does cause quite a few other kinds of cancers. It affects males and females differently when it comes to fertility. Probably the second most common cancer is endometrial cancer in women. And there was a New England Journal of Medicine study showing that by age 35, a huge percentage of women with Lynch syndrome already have some endometrial cancer. So it does affect your fertility, you know, at the ages when you are thinking about having children. And similarly, ovarian cancer, of course, does affect your fertility. And there aren't any similar cancers in men that would affect fertility. Well, ultimately, I chose to use egg donation and surrogacy. But during the course of my life, I was offered other options. Even in my 20s, when I first had genetic testing, I was offered the chance to freeze my eggs. And they told me that I did have the option to pursue pre-implantation genetic testing, since we knew the exact genetic change that causes my syndrome. In my early 20s, I wasn't ready to have children and didn't think it was a good use of my really limited financial resources at that time to pursue egg freezing. And I also didn't really feel like it would be wrong to have a child with the same syndrome that I have when it did come time to have children. And then again, later, when I got endometrial cancer, which was in my 30s, I was again offered the chance to, freeze my egg or even to make embryos at that time. And I elected not to do that at that time, partly because I didn't want to delay removal of my cancer, but also because I felt like adoption is an option. And also I felt like not having children altogether was an option that was acceptable to me. Ultimately, when I was ready to have children, I did use the egg donor and the surrogate. You know, at that point, I was choosing between adoption, not having children, and having children with the egg donor and surrogate. Those were really my only options. And I chose the egg donor and surrogate because I felt like it would be nice to have children that were genetically related to my husband's family. At that point, by that time, I knew people who had done international adoption and who had done adoption from the foster care system. And so I knew that those options also involve a lot of money and a lot of logistics and can have a lot of complication involved. So to me, the egg donor and surrogate, it has its own barriers, but they didn't seem any more insurmountable than the other options. With egg donation and surrogacy, I would say there's two main challenges. For us, the first main challenge is that the whole process really takes a long time. So first you have to identify an agency that's going to coordinate the whole process, and you have to have a legal agreement with them. And that involves some contract negotiation. Then you have to identify the egg donor. And the way we did that was we basically looked on egg donation agency websites, and it's kind of like being on Match.com. And at first, when you look, maybe you don't really see anyone that you like, so you're kind of waiting for somebody you like to show up. And when they do, then you try to, connect with them and get a contract with them. So it took kind of a long time to do that. Once we did identify a donor who was interested in working with us, it still takes a long time because of the amount of contract negotiation that has to happen. And then she also has to go through quite a bit of medical screening. And then both parties have to go through psychological screening. And that's all before you even start the medical process of egg donation. And then the egg donation itself, I can't remember exactly how long it takes, whether it takes 1 or 2 months, but it takes a little while. So that whole process takes quite a while. Then after we had the eggs donated, we had them made into embryos and genetically screened and frozen down. Then the next step was to get a surrogate. Now, some people will try to identify both an egg donor and a surrogate at the same time and kind of coordinate this process better. But to us, it seemed unnecessarily complicated to try and do that. So we chose to freeze down the eggs. Then we got on a wait list for a surrogate, and we were on the wait list something like 6 months before we had a candidate identified. Then what you do is you review the profile, which again is kind of like looking at a Match.com profile. We thought she seemed reasonable. So then you have a phone call with her. And then the next step is to go on a double date with her and her husband. And then if all parties decide to go ahead, then you start the medical and psychological screening process with the clinic, and also the negotiation through your lawyers for the contract. And for us at that point, right when the potential surrogate was supposed to start getting medically screened, she kind of dropped out of the process. I think it was just too many visits for her. So we were on the waiting list again, and kind of repeated the process with our second candidate, who was great. That worked out very well and was pretty straightforward, but still takes quite a while. I think it was about 1.5 years after we first started looking until she became pregnant with our embryo. So it's really a long time. And then you also have to wait through the pregnancy. I think the whole process for us took about 3 years. So time is a major barrier. Then the next barrier with this option is the cost. It's probably one of the more expensive fertility options. The cost of an egg donation is something like $30,000. And then the surrogacy really varies a lot in cost depending on how the pregnancy goes, because if there's complications, then it can be more expensive for you. And then also the surrogate herself may choose, some of them will charge higher fees or lower fees, but you need to budget something like $100,000 for that part of the process. So I think that's a major barrier as well. And that's something I couldn't have considered early in life. I just didn't have the financial resources. I didn't even have the financial resources really to consider egg freezing at that time. So it's not for everyone. It's really for if you have the resources to do it. I think that I did make the right choice for myself at the time, and I'm still happy with my choice. But if I could do it over again, I think I probably should have frozen my eggs. I think it would have been simpler in some ways. And then also, I know that my children may one day feel some loss over the fact that they may not get to meet the egg donor. It might be possible, but it might not. And I know that can be hard for people. It's sort of similar to people who are adopted sometimes feel some loss from not knowing who their genetic relatives are. I would tell myself to start the process a lot earlier, even if you're not exactly sure what you want to do, you might as well start pursuing your options because it takes a long time.